Well, today we get back into our sermon series, The Bible's Greatest Hits, where we're looking at some of the most popular Bible passages as determined by searches at BibleGateway.com. And our reading from today is from Romans. It's number 7 on the list. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Sounds really good, right? And of course it is good. That's why the Apostle Paul told us to do it. But as with a lot of the things we read in the Bible, it's a lot easier to say it than to do it, right? We know that we should look for God's will and that we should try to do God's will. For Christians, that's really the main thing that we should do. And the fact is that most of the time, it's not really all that hard to figure out God's will. It can be, but an awful lot of the time it's not. And now when I say that, understand I'm making a distinction between knowing God's plans and God's purposes for our lives and looking for and doing God's will on a day-to-day basis. Of course, God will always have plans and purposes that we know nothing about. That's part of what makes God God. God's plans and purposes are far deeper and far-reaching than anything we could ever hope to understand. But looking for and doing God's will is usually not all that hard. Again, it can be. We sometimes have to make major decisions, and sometimes we have a hard time figuring out what God would want us to do in this or that situation. But as we go about the day-to-day business of living, it's really not usually all that hard. Jesus gave us a lot of information on the subject, after all. Jesus said that doing God's will in our day-to-day lives means loving God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind and all of our strength. Doing God's will in our day-to-day lives means loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. Doing God's will in our day-to-day lives means doing to others what we would like them to do to us. Those things are usually not all that hard to figure out. So if they're not that hard to figure out, why don't we do them? Now that's not really fair. We do them sometimes. There are times when we do love God. There are times when we do love others. There are times when we treat others the way we'd like to be treated. There are times when we do all that stuff. But there are times when we don't do any of that too. Certainly plenty of times when I don't. And again, the question is then, why not? If we know God wants us to do those things, why don't we do them? Why is it that so many times, as our verses say, we choose to conform to the pattern of this world rather than following God's good and pleasing and perfect will? Why is it so much easier to say this stuff than to do it? Well, part of the reason is that the world puts a lot of pressure on us to conform to its pattern. And it's not hard to understand why. I mean, the world, after all, is the place we live, right? And it's hard not to conform to the standards and practices of the place you live. Those standards and practices make themselves known in all kinds of ways. They make themselves known through the media. They make themselves known through rules of society, both written laws and unwritten rules. They make themselves known by the expectations of the people we work for, the people we work with. They make themselves known through the expectations of our families, the expectations of our friends. Every day, every hour, almost every minute, the standards and practices of the world make themselves known to us in all kinds of ways. And the reason it's so hard not to conform to them is that we know in the short term that our lives will probably be easier if we do. It's always easier to follow the crowd. It's always easier to live the way everybody else does. It's always easier to do things the way everybody else does them. Not following the crowd, not living the way everybody else does, that a lot of times will make our lives harder. It can cost us money. It can cost us our jobs sometimes. Sometimes it can even result in going to jail, losing your freedom. And even if it does not do any of those things, it can cost us relationships with our friends, sometimes with our families even. You know, people will look at us funny when we don't conform to the pattern of this world. They'll think there's something strange about us. Because of that, they might not want to be around us a whole lot. And none of that is very much fun. It can be really hard to deal with. And I suspect that at least some of us can think of times when those things have happened to us. Some of us have had times when we were honest and we followed God's way rather than the way of the world. It cost us money. We've had times when friends dropped us because we would not go along with the way of the world. Instead, decided we were going to follow God's way. That's not easy. It's a natural thing to want to have friends. It's a natural thing to want the people around us to like us and to think well of us. What makes it harder still is just the fact that we are human. That means that some of these standards and practices of the world are pretty appealing to us. We'd like to follow them. Sometimes we know we should not, but it sure makes things a lot easier. It sure makes life more fun. And we think, what real difference would it make? Nobody would be hurt by it. God would understand. It's always tempting to take the easy way out. And it is understandable. After all, life is hard enough as it is, right? Nobody wants to do something that's going to make life even harder. We're all looking for ways to make our lives easier. And if going along with the crowd, going along with the standards and practices of the world is going to do that, well, it's pretty tempting to do it. Nobody would blame us. In fact, a lot of people would be pleased by it. A lot of people would be pleased. But God would not be. Now, I assume God would understand. God understands everything, but that's not the same as saying that God approves or that God's okay with us doing that. Because the goal of the Christian, the goal of all of us, is not to conform to the standards and practices of the world. The goal of a Christian really is not even to conform to the standards and practices of a church. The goal of a Christian is to conform to the standards and practices of God. After all, that's part of the reason Jesus came here. Jesus, as I've said before, did not come with a message that said, just keep doing what you've been doing. Would have been no point for him to come here and give that message. Jesus did not come with a message that said, hey, you need to be more like the people around you. Jesus said, you need to be more like God. He said it to you and he said it to me. Jesus came to remind us that we were created in the image of God, not the image of other people. In Ephesians 5, Paul writes that we are supposed to be imitators of God, not imitators of other people, not conform to the standards and practices of the world. Imitators of God, transformed into people who follow the standards and practices of God. It's not easy. And I think that's part of the reason why Paul says that we need to offer ourselves as living sacrifices. Because the only way we can really do this is if we give up a part of ourselves. We need to give up that part of ourselves that wants to go along to get along. We need to give up that part of ourselves that tries to win the approval of human beings. No matter how highly respected or highly placed those human beings may be. We need to give up that part of ourselves that wants to follow the crowd, that wants to get ahead. Regardless of whether get ahead means getting more money or getting a better job or getting more friends or whatever getting ahead means to each of us. We need to give up that part of ourselves that wants to do what everybody else does, because that's going to make our lives easier. That's the sacrifice we make if we decide not to conform to the standards and practices of this world and instead to be transformed into God's people, following the standards and practices of God. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. It sounds really good, and it is good. But it's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy. Paul never said it was going to be easy. It was not easy for Paul. He suffered terribly because of his faith, because he would not go along and get along, because he would not conform to the standards and practices of this world. It was not easy for lots of other Christians. Of course, it was not easy for Jesus himself. He got into constant trouble because he would not conform to the standards and practices of this world. And it's not easy today. Loving God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength. Loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. Doing to others as we would like others to do to us. None of that conforms to the standards and practices of the world. Not if we take it seriously anyway. Because it's not enough to do those things once in a while when the mood strikes us to make ourselves feel better. If we're going to be transformed into God's people, we need to do them all the time. Not that we can never be perfect, of course, that's not what I'm saying, but it needs to be our goal. It needs to be our goal to do that. To do it all the time. Because if enough of us do this all the time, it would not just be ourselves who were transformed, would it? If enough of us did this all the time, eventually the entire world would be transformed. It would be transformed into the world it's supposed to be, and we would be the people that we are supposed to be. God's people, living in God's world. The official mission statement of the United Methodist Church is to go and make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. If we're going to transform the world, we need to first transform ourselves. There's no better day to start than today. And it's not going to be easy, but it is going to be worth it.